So this video is posted and Hanukkah has finished its season. Hanukkah this year was December 15th through the 22nd. So this video's posted, of course, well after the 22nd. Now, this is the annual Hanukkah video I have done each year. This is now the 5th video in this Hanukkah series, and here you can see the playlist. It's got its own playlist. You got 4 videos there. When this one is finished and done, it will be added to that playlist. But let's remind ourselves what Hanukkah is, and let's remind ourselves that Jesus actually attended Hanukkah Feast of Dedication, the celebration of lights. It's known by several names. 10:22, John. At that time, the Feast of Dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple in the colonnade of Solomon. So the Jews gathered around him, and etc. They engaged him. Jesus went up and attended this festival of Hanukkah. So yes, Jesus went and attended the festival of Hanukkah. This celebration is now an annual event, as any of us have been walking around our town, especially if we live in Western society. We will see Hanukkah celebration items and food items, festivities taking place all around us. Now, here's what weak, unknowledgeable Seventh-day Adventists like to say. They say, well, Jesus, he didn't really attend the event, or just because his attendance at the event doesn't mean he accepted the event. Well, that's an argument from silence. Jesus attended events. He attended, before Hanukkah, the Festival of Booths, the Festival of Tents. When he shows up, he attends. By the way, if Jesus went somewhere and he didn't agree with something, you knew it. Just look with me here in the scriptures. John chapter 2. And Jesus went into the temple, and then what? He made a whip of cords, and he drove them out of the temple with sheep and oxen. And he said, take these things away, and don't make my Father's house into a house of trade. So when Jesus disagreed with something, and he showed up, you knew it. Well, Jesus showed up to Hanukkah, and he didn't exactly make a cord of whips and start driving people out saying, don't you dare celebrate this because the temple isn't going to be cleared until 1844 because William Miller said so in his funny chronology, a day equals a year equals a day equals a year, or was a bing, 1844. No, the temple was cleansed already, and we're going to see that again. It occurred about 164 years before Jesus was born, and this was an annual event. They already had over 160 Hanukkah celebrations, so the temple was cleansed. Daniel 8:14, done. Let's remind ourselves, look at 2 Maccabees chapter 10, and having cleansed the temple, they made another altar. I'm going to go over this a couple more times. And then 10:6, and they kept the 8 days with gladness. That's Hanukkah, the festival of the tabernacles. Verse 8, they ordained also a common statute and decree that every year these should be kept, a whole nation of the Jews. Verse 3, they cleansed the temple. Verse 8, statute, every year we're going to have the celebration, and we see Jesus attend that celebration. So Jesus attended this event. Now, here's something else I want to bring about this year that's going to be different from the other previous 4 Hanukkah videos. Jesus attended an event only made possible through war. The Maccabees engaged in armed conflict with their Greek conquerors. So Hanukkah and the cleansing of the temple was made only possible by men, real men, who took up arms and fought and defeated their conqueror invaders, and who were willing to fight on the Sabbath, by the way, which we are going to see here. So we're going to talk about Judas Maccabeus. So let's just look with me here at 1 Maccabees 2:4. So his name is Judas, was called Maccabeus. And then it's put together here throughout the book of Maccabees. It'll just say Judas Maccabeus. But I want you to know that this is kind of how we get there. Look at 266, Judas Maccabeus. And it says, let him be your captain. So they made him like a general to fight the battles for the people. Chapter 8, verse 1, he assembled 6,000 men, and they called upon the Lord. And because of what these ungodly men, still in verse 2, had done to their temple. They had enough. And you can look here in verse 6 on the bottom. And they ended up fighting them and overcoming them And it says, and no small number. In other words, their enemy was not small. They were a pretty well-sized enemy. Let's look at the next one here, 2 Maccabees 8:16. So Maccabees, this is Judas Maccabees, called together 6,000 men. And then in 8:17, and he set before their eyes the injury. In other words, he said, look what they've done to our temple. They have profaned it. And in verses 18, 19, and 20, he gives them like a pep talk. And then we get to verse 21. And thus he had made them bold with these words. It's the words above. And they were ready to die for the law and for their country. So he took his 6,000 men we see in verse 16, and in verse 21, he divided them into 4 parts. And in verse 24, and by the help of the Almighty, they slew 9,000. So these 6,000 men that we see in 2 Maccabees 8:16 slew 9,000 men. This is war. This is an act of armed war and rebellion by the Jews and Judas Maccabean. Now, look here in 2 Maccabees 10:1. Maccabees and his company, the Lord guiding them, recovered the temple and the city. Verse 2, the altars which the heathen had built in the open street and the chapels, they what? They tore them down. They cleansed the temple. That's what Hanukkah is about, the cleansing of the temple. Done. Daniel 8:14, done. The rebellion was finished by Judas Maccabeus, but it was actually started by his father, Matthias. So what I came to discover is that the Maccabean doctrine of warfare really changed Jewish warfare a lot, because you're going to see here what they were willing to do. In other words, let me start again. Judas Maccabeus didn't start this rebellion. It was his father who started the rebellion. And here's why, and here's what happened. Look with me here. 1 Maccabees chapter 2, verses 29 to 38. I'm not going to read all this to you, and you can pause it if you read it if you want, but here's what happened. There were some Jews who during this occupation said, we're going to get out of here. We're going to go to the wilderness because we're tired of these captors. We're tired of what they do to us. The captors went and followed them and chased them and said, you got to follow the command of our king. Remember now, this Antiochus wanted them to worship false gods and wanted them to do all kinds of things to break their law. And these Jews said, no, we ain't doing it. These invaders said to these Jews in this whole scenario here, you do it or we're going to kill you. And it was the Sabbath. And the Jews said, that's fine, it's the Sabbath, we ain't fighting back. And the very last line, 1,000 Jews were killed as a result of that. Enter Matthias, Judas Maccabeus' father. Verse 39 here. Now when Matthias and his friends understood what had just happened, they mourned for their lost countrymen. And look at verse 41. Whoever shall come to make battle with us on the Sabbath, we're going to fight him. Did you hear that, Seventh-day Adventists? Matthias, a Sabbath-keeping, law-abiding Jew, says, you want to come fight me on the Sabbath? Bring it on, because we are going to fight you back. Verse 42, then came unto them the Assyrians, who were mighty men of Israel, even as such who were voluntarily devoted unto the law. These were law keepers who understood that observing the Sabbath is all well and good, but when it comes down to a matter of life and death, we're going to break the Sabbath and we're going to fight for ourselves. And that's exactly what they did. Now, just so that you know, I looked at the Jewish Encyclopedia here, and we have the originator of the Maccabean rebellion. We can see it's Matthias at the top. And then it says here in the lower right-hand corner, the rabbinical sources, they never mention all of Matthias' sons together. And I got Judas here. But the first book of Maccabees and Josephus enumerates the sons of Matthias as follows, and then lists them all out, and we have Judas Maccabeus is one of the sons. Through an act of rebellion leading to war, the Jews assembled an army of fighting men and took back their temple, cleansed the temple, and defeated their occupier. And they fought them even if it meant fighting on a Sabbath. So thus began the Jewish concept and Jewish doctrine of war of at least defensive war was permitted on the Sabbath. That later is going to change, by the way, but we're going to stick within this historical framework. So Jesus attended Hanukkah. Now think about this. He attended Hanukkah, which is an event only made possible through armed conflict, and armed conflict that wasn't restricted to a Sabbath, or wasn't restricted because of a Sabbath. They would fight on a Sabbath. And Jesus attends that event. And he was apparently fine with that. Of course, Adventists aren't fine with that, but Adventists don't understand the Word of God. So Judas Maccabean did not assemble an army of vegan, vegetarian, pale-faced, skinny, pacifist, Seventh-day Adventist types or office workers. No, he assembled fighting men. Adventists teach to be a fighting soldier is to be wrong. That's why, we'll enlist in the military and we'll be doctors and, medics and all these other things. But look at all these Sabbath-keeping Jews that we just saw already. They're willing to fight, and they're willing to fight on a Sabbath. Thank goodness that we didn't have any Seventh-day Adventists in the Bible here, or, I don't know, the temple would never have gotten cleansed, and all kinds of other things bad would have happened. So, now, in terms of Adventists and their doctrine of war, Adventists had to, for their first time, face the threat of war, and what are we going to do with it during the Civil War? Because Adventism didn't start until, 1840s. Or we can say officially, 1863. But Adventism started in the 1840s. Ellen White was your prophetess, giving you divine revelations from 1844. Adventism really started in 1844. All right, so let's look here at this article. This is the very first article kicking off the Adventist conversation about war. And what do we do? And it's by James White, and it's an article called The Nation. You will see this reference several times in this video here. So in this article, James White says a number of things. And here's one of them here. He talks about, he knows that this war, this is the Civil War in the United States, was about slavery and how slavery was horrible and a damning sin unto the nation. And then he goes on to say the position which our people have taken relative to the perpetuality and sacredness of the law of God and the Ten Commandments, that's not in harmony with war. Because you got to remember the Sabbath, and then the sixth commandment says, thou shalt not kill. So how can we be soldiers and remember the Sabbath and be soldiers and kill when it's two of the Ten Commandments are being broken, is what he's saying here. But then he says this, in the case of drafting, in other words, you're going to be drafted, the government assumes the responsibility for the violation of law. So maybe it's not you, you're just doing what the government says. The violation of the law will be on them, not you, because, and then he goes on to say, it would be madness to resist. Why? Because if you resist, there's a good chance you're going to get killed. Let's see what else James White said in this Nation article. We at present are enjoying the protection of our religious liberties from the best government under heaven, but we can still call into question, some of the things that they're doing. And then he goes on to say here, but for us to attempt to resist the laws of the best government under heaven, the United States. So there's James White calling the United States the best government under heaven, and which is struggling to put down this rebellion of the South. It would be madness. And what he means by that is because you resist the draft, you're going to be shot for being a draft evader. So don't resist this and get killed. And then he's talking about, and there's those that, are considering sneaking off to Canada or to Europe and hiding in fear of the draft. I could see a bunch of Adventists, they're going to run away to Canada and Europe and hide the event. But anyway, we're going to see there's two classes of Adventists here. So what I did find in the Adventist Heritage magazine was an article which cites this Nation article and then goes further and beyond that and details the Adventist position, really the development of the Adventist position on war. So look with me here. So you see here we have a 4-page article from January of 1974 when Seventh-day Adventists first faced war. Let's look at some of the points here. This discussion began, and you just saw where it began. It began with that 1862 article in the Review and Herald called The Nation, written by James White. That's where it started. But then it continued. And they're quoting some actually parts here from the article about how war is going to require you to possibly not remember the Sabbath, and it's going to require you to kill, and you're going to be breaking the 4th commandment and the 6th commandment. And then they cite the article again that we already saw from the Nation about, if you do this, maybe it's it's going to be on the government, it's not going to be on you. And then, by the way, don't refuse to obey the draft because, you may get killed, and they think that that's going a little too far. Then it goes on to say from August until the end of October, week after week, in the Review and Herald, there were columns where they were discussing and debating this. Lower right-hand corner. Now, his views, this is James White, because James White didn't actually say not to go. But he didn't actually say to go. But he didn't say not to go. And because he didn't say not to go, this aroused the opposition of Adventist soy boy pacifist who didn't want to go. Besides, it says here, besides, it was not quite clear from the article precisely, did he advise the Adventists what to do or not to do? So the soy boy Adventists wanted to say, you should have just came out and told us not to do it. But he didn't. So let's continue reading. But there was a masculine group within Seventh-day Adventists who actually opposed the soy boy Adventists. And they were enthusiastic, pro-war position. You can see Joseph Clark was here. He said, let us go. I read more in the article here. He wanted to go fight the rebellious southern slave states. So we had two factions here. And then there was this brother from New York. He was a believer in the cause of the Union, in other words, the anti-slavery cause, but he said, well, if we live in army camps, it's just going to be kind of immoral. Let's go on to the next one here, upper right-hand corner. James White, he restated his views in another article and his attitude to the church, although he still was ambiguous in his position. This is it. Now enter Ellen White. She was then no neutral, but at the time she saw the kingdom of the world of this world at hand. Prophecy shows us the great day of God Almighty is upon us. She wrote in 1863. I can see at this point. Here's Ellen White in 1863 going, oh please, please, please let Jesus come back like he was supposed to come back in 1844, and all this ends, and we don't have to figure out this war stuff. But it didn't happen quite like that. Here's what did happen. In the lower right-hand corner, Ellen White conveniently ends the debate of the discussion and says, I was shown that God's people, who are his peculiar treasure, that is, cannot engage in this perplexing war, for it's opposed to every principle of their faith. Thus, Seventh-day Adventists, even those who really wanted to go, who didn't agree with the soy boy Adventists, well, now Ellen White came out and said you can't do it. So the Adventist controversy and debate over do we go into military and armed conflict or not was settled. Here, yet again, is another Adventist doctrine created because of a vision of Ellen White. Not Bible study, not even reasoned debate amongst the men leadership of your church, Adventists, but Ellen White coming out saying, oh, I saw a vision and we can't do this. Once again, there it is. And here's a copy of that original testimony. It's actually testimony number 9, called The Rebellion, in the original testimonies. If you have the modern testimony set, the 9-volume set, you will find it on page 1 and page 342, which you will find it right here. And here's the actual testimony itself. I was shown we can't engage in this perplexing war, worldly men and principles. We can't keep the requirements of God, the laws of God, etc. So the Sabbath remains the prime reason Seventh-day Adventists refuse to enlist. And the 6th commandment, thou shalt not kill, was like a secondary reason. Now let me say this. There is no Sabbath-keeping Jew. And I brought this one out for you, Seventh-day Adventists. This is my 1630 KJV. With the Apocrypha, there is no Sabbath-keeping Jew in the Old Testament who said, whoa, wait a second, we can't be engaging in no war. We might have to fight on the Sabbath. And the 6th commandment says, thou shalt not kill. The Old Testament is full of Jewish Old Testament warriors. Joshua, Gideon, Samson, David, and I could go on and on and on. None of them believe like Adventists believe. Because if they did, well, I guess we wouldn't have a Bible. No, they were warriors. And they fought their enemy. And you're going to see in some cases, well, fighting on a Sabbath was permitted. So let's look at some examples. As a matter of fact, you already saw it in 2 Maccabees, where the Maccabees said, you go ahead, attack us on a Sabbath. We're fighting you back. Do it. And, well, it doesn't say whether they did or not, but they were willing to do it. So let's look at some New Testament examples of soldiers in the New Testament, and let's see how that all worked out for them. Here is John the Baptist in Luke chapter 3. Soldiers asked him, John the Baptist, what shall we do? Wow, and what did John the Baptist say? You better get out of the military because you can't keep the 4th commandment, you can't keep the 6th commandment. No, he didn't. When he said, what shall we do? What did he tell him? Hey, don't extort money from people. Be happy with your wages. Or don't make false accusations or threats. In other words, just be a good, honest person in your military service. Didn't tell him to leave. But if there was ever a time in the New Testament for a New Testament prophet to tell someone, get out of the military, stop being a fighting soldier, it was right here. Because the soldiers asked him, what shall we do? And what did he? And you can read what he said. How about this? Here's Romans 13, 1 through 4. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Now, I'm going to use Romans 13, 1 through 4 only in the vein of the American Civil War, because Adventists wanted to rebel against the American government during the American Civil War. So I'm not talking about any other time period, no other government. I am just talking about the United States government and the American Civil War, which was in the early 1860s. That's it. Every person be subject to his government. Adventist, 1860s. For there's no authority except from God. Did you hear that? President Lincoln at that time, we can say, was an authority from God and instituted by God. Romans 13:1. And why? Because if you resist him, look at verse 2. Hey, you're going to incur judgment. Like you're going to get shot if you refuse to go to the draft. How about Romans 13:3? For rulers are not a terror to good, but to bad. Was slavery bad? Yeah, James White even said slavery was bad. So these rulers are not a terror for the good, but to the bad, in this case to the Southern rebels. And verse 4, for he is God's servant. Lincoln is God's servant for your good. And if you do wrong, don't worry, because he doesn't bear the sword in vain. Lincoln will have you shot. And he had people shot during the Civil War. And what do Adventists do? They won't ignore this whole passage here. They do not understand the Bible. They do not understand Romans 13, 1 through 4. The same thing is kind of repeated here in 1 Peter 2, 13 and 14. Basically repeats Romans 13, 1 through 4. How about the faith of the centurion who comes to Christ? A centurion appealing to him that his servant is laying paralyzed at home and suffering terribly, and he said to him, he wanted him to come heal him, and the centurion in verse 9 says, he understands Jesus. He says, for I too am a man under authority and soldiers under me, etc. Did Jesus ever tell him, hey, you know what, by the way, you need to get out of here, put up your sword, be a medic, and be a vegan vegetarian medic? How about that? No. And by the way, did the Roman legion observe the Sabbath? So here is this soldier here, and we knew he is not taking the Sabbath off. The Roman legion doesn't take Sabbath off. How about this one here? Peter and Cornelius. At Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion, a devout man of God. And verse 4, your prayers and your alms ascended as a memorial before God. A armed soldier whose prayers and alms ascend as a memorial to God is never told to leave. Jesus Christ died on the cross, a sacrificial lamb. Revelation 19:11 through 16. He is coming back a roaring soldier on a white horse. He is going to be, as you see in verse 13, he's clothed in a robe dipped in blood, and by the name which is called the Word of God, and armies of heaven arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. Let me sum it up here. Jesus attended Hanukkah, an event made possible by an act of war that did not restrict fighting from occurring on the Sabbath. Jesus knew this event was an act of war. All the Jews knew it was an act of war. And war that, again, and Sabbath fighting on it was not exempt. No one in the Old Testament refused military service like Adventists do today. No one in the Old Testament said, sorry, I'm not carrying a sword because it says thou shalt not kill. And we might have to fight on the Sabbath. Sorry, I can't do it, but I'll be your little vegan medic going along with you guys. So that doesn't happen. The Adventist pacifist position is weak, and it contradicts Romans 13, 1 through 4. The Adventist position is not supported by any text in the Bible. The Adventist position regarding non-combatants, not supported by any text in the Bible. I have absolutely no compassion and no anything for Seventh-day Adventists because they are not willing to bear arms. I was willing to bear arms, and I did bear arms. I jumped out of airplanes with the 82nd Airborne for 4 years and came back home and was at reactive duty again when I was doing drug interdiction on the border. Adventists will do none of that. So I, therefore, based on my experience in these passive soy boy Adventists, no sympathy for Adventists whatsoever. Next year, by the way, I'm going to address the thou shalt not kill command and show where Adventists get that completely wrong. But this ends the 5th Hanukkah video, which actually just lays bare the weak character of the Adventist male who refuses to go to war force country, as Romans 13:1 through 4 on a just war will tell them to do.